Hello, Mark Pack here. And just before we get to the latest podcast, a quick plug for my weekly email newsletter all about political opinion polls, The Week in Polls. Comes out every Sunday, 6 p.m, with news and analysis from the latest political polling. And you can sign up for free at theweekinpolls.co.uk. Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. This time I'm delighted to be joined by one of the most popular previous guests, who I'm sure was popular both for her own expertise but also because of the subject, election leaflets. And that is Caitlin. So welcome back to the show, Caitlin. Really glad to have you back.
Thanks.
And lots of leaflets are appearing through letterboxes literally as we record this. So do you want to give listeners a little bit of context first? Why is it that I like to call you the Professor of Political Leafleting?
That's much more generous than the leaflet lady, which I get from others. So I have a love of leaflets, as they say. So I became interested in leaflets because we know a lot about what parties and candidates do during a general election campaign. You know, where they go, who they talk to, but one of the things we don't know a lot about is what they say. So I started with a colleague here at the University of Nottingham. We started the Open Elections Project, which was focused on content coding, so understanding the content of election leaflets. So the goal of this project was really to have a better understanding of how parties and candidates tailor their campaign in different parts of the country, because we know that people say different things depending on how popular their party is, how popular their leader is, and where they're campaigning and what their demographics look like. So we really wanted to be able to shed light on this really fascinating variation.
Yeah. And as we record it, I was just looking earlier today at the latest YouGov poll, which was asking people what they had, amongst the usual questions about voting intention and so on. It was asking whether what they had seen of the general election campaign so far made them think better or worse of different parties. And I was particularly struck that for my own party, it was 5% think better of the Lib Dems as a result of what they've seen, 3% think worse. Everyone else is either unchanged, already had a view, don't know. And I think it's a pretty safe bet, therefore, that more people have had their views altered by what they've seen through the letterbox in leaflets than through the TV and the national media and so on so far. Because if those 5% and 3% figures were 50 and 30, you'd think, well, that's definitely the impact of the 6 o'clock news and so on. Mm-hmm. But leaflets are probably the main way that people are, or the most important way, maybe less than, not a plurality, but the most important way that people are forming a view of the Lib Dems. Probably similar for the Greens. I guess for Labour and the Tories, the national media coverage does play a bigger role, but they are a really important part of what happens in elections, aren't they?
They are. So one of the really interesting things about the ways that people engage during the campaign is we hear a lot about new media. I guess it's not really that new anymore, but social media and ways that parties are trying to connect with people on the internet. But one of the really fascinating things is that election leaflets, really kind of traditional leaflets, remain the most common way that parties and candidates engage with voters. So we have something called the British Election Survey, which measures voters throughout the campaign and after the election. And consistently over the last many general elections, the most common ways that voters say that they engaged with the party was through their leaflets. And this makes a lot of sense, because if you think about things like social media, oftentimes you are more likely to connect with a party that matches your predispositions, right? So you follow Lib Dems because you are a Lib Dem yourself. Yeah. Election leaflets are different because anyone can send you one. Obviously, you would still have to decide whether you want to read it or not, but they can reach anyone. So oftentimes they can reach voters who may be on the fence or maybe don't have a sufficiently strong view that they'd be willing to follow them on Twitter or in other platforms like Instagram.
So if that's a little bit about why leaflets are so important, what do we know from your previous research about what works, what doesn't work, what parties get up to in the privacy of people's letterboxes?
So one of the most important things we learned from our research is really goes to kind of a common preconception that we have about leaflets, that they're all the same, right? So parties use the same leaflets in different places. And to some extent, that's true. Almost every party has national leaflets that they send across the country. But we do see kind of common ways. We do see more and more that there's templates that candidates are allowed to personalize that content, and that's where the really interesting material comes out. So one of the things that we focused on, we focus on a lot of different aspects of leaflets in our research, but one of the things we focused a lot on is negative campaigning. This is controversial, but quite common. So looking at how parties talk about not just their own policy platforms, but how do they engage with their opponents? And opponents might be an opposing party, it might be an opposing leader, it might be an opposing candidate in the constituency. And this is really quite fascinating. One of the things that probably comes as a surprise to no one is that negative campaigning, as we would call it, is really quite common. So roughly 70% of leaflets, more or less in some general elections, include at least one message about an opposing candidate. Now, that's not necessarily to say that they're attacking, as you might think. Oftentimes people think negative campaigning is really going for the jugular. But we just define it as any message that where you criticize your opponent, because it's very rare for a candidate to say nice things about someone they're competing against. So in terms of our research, we've exposed, the way that negativity is used. So we find out that challenging candidates are much more likely than incumbents to use negative campaigning. And this makes a lot of sense because oftentimes negative campaigning can be viewed as a risk. People don't like it, so they don't like the idea of it. So you really only want to use it if you're reasonably sure that either you have nothing else to say, or you want to be reasonably sure that it's going to work. One of the other things that we find from some of our newer research is actually there's a lot of variation in how criticism is used. So criticism can take the form of talking about an opposing candidate's voting record. So if you're campaigning against a sitting MP, you could say, look, he's voted on this particular policy in this way. And you might choose to mention that person by name, or just say, something like my Tory opponent. You might also choose to focus on the party leader, attacking their record or criticizing their policy positions. You might also focus on kind of policy and the local level. And so we look at these different types of negativity to try to find out what voters think is actually negative. And the reason why we're quite interested in this is because much of what we know about negative campaigning comes from the study of the US. And the type of negativity that we see in British elections tends to be, shall I say, relatively softer, perhaps the type of negativity that we use in American general elections, American elections quite commonly. So we were quite interested to see do voters actually see criticism, which we might think of as just a normal campaign tactic? Do they actually see that as negativity or not? Because that's how political scientists would define it.
And last time we spoke, I think, if I remember rightly, I spoke up a bit in defense of negative campaigning, in that I think there are two sorts of defensible negative campaigning. One is the criticism for, let's say, the government's current Rwanda policy. If you think that policy is expensive, immoral, etc., that is quite a negative view to hold. But also, I think in a democracy, most people would view is a respectable, is a reasonable point of view, and indeed maybe even a necessary point of view to disagree with the government. But there's also the sort of negativity that is maybe, if Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister, attacking him over Partygate, but also maybe even attacking Dominic Cummings over, going on a drive to test his eyesight and all of that sort of stuff. Even though Dominic Cummings is neither, an election candidate himself, nor an immediate family member of an election candidate, but, in a sense is a little bit removed. But I think most people would view that somebody like that, if they have done something wrong and if what you're saying is true, then that is fair game. But then if somebody were to say, choose to attack the Prime Minister over something his wife has done, that gets into more troublesome territory, I think most people would view. Although even there, I think we see this at the moment, and we'll probably doubtless continue to see it during this general election campaign, a range of views about whether it is acceptable or not to attack the Prime Minister for how rich he is, and therefore get into talking about his wife's finances and their collective tax affairs and so on. So where do you find the public? Well, I guess there are two questions I have. One is, where does the public tell you the line is between acceptable and unacceptable? And then the other question is, where is the line really? Because what people say is reasonable may not actually be quite the same as just as people are more willing to say that they're going to vote in an election than they actually do, I guess people might give a slightly more decorous answer to a professor asking them than they really believe deep down in the middle of their soul.
Well, so I think a lot of it goes to, I mean, we have this debate in political science about, what does it mean to be negative? And is negative a bad thing, right? So negative itself has a, shall I say, negative connotation. But in fact, negative campaigning can actually provide lots of information, right? So if you provide information about your policy platforms and you contrast those directly with how your opponent sits on the same issues, that's really, really helpful for voters. And it can provide them with really valuable information about, well, actually, I fit here versus here. And so that can actually help them make really informed choices. What we find from our research is that there's a line between the policy and the personal, as we might say. Yeah. So one of the things that we find when we did an experiment on a nationally representative sample was that policy criticism is totally fine. Voters don't punish you for it. Actually, they think that's very reasonable. Now, they still recognize it as negative, but actually it doesn't affect how they view candidates, either the attacker or the person that's being targeted. Where we see that line, which I think makes a great deal of sense, is when you begin to get into the personal. And I mean, putting aside some of the kind of more perhaps contentious things that you just mentioned around Boris Johnson and his family, that isn't usually the type of negativity that we would see in leaflets, which would be much more like, my opponent doesn't live in the constituency, or he's a career politician, right? So those are negative personal, we might say attacks, negative personal comments, criticisms, but they're not kind of that. But even there, that's where we begin to see that line. So voters don't really like it when you attack the personal. And actually, one of the things that we find is that candidates who attack on personal grounds often experience a backlash in terms of evaluations of their own party when they do that. And one of the particularly interesting things about that project is we find that backlash is greater for people who don't identify with a party or the attacking party or the target. So basically what that means is it's a double backlash. So oftentimes if you're in a two-party contest, the people you want to convince are the people that don't affiliate with either yourself or your opponent. You want to persuade them to join you. And these are exactly the people that we find are turned off by personal attacks.
Yeah. I guess in my experience, the sort of personal attacks that work best are, I guess, have three characteristics. One is that you can justify them in terms of the truth. One is that they're about something that people feel is relevant. And the third is that it contrasts with something positive. So, for example, I think often it is quite effective in election campaigns if, say, your candidate is local, is well known in the area, is very committed to it, and the other side's candidate has recently rocked up and won a selection and has got very little connection with the seat. That negativity, as it were, works and is often very effective, but in part because it's the flip side of the positive. And I think that rounded message, rather than the negativity purely on its own, is that part of what you looked at, to what extent the pairing of messages?
Yes, so that's exactly what we look at, is that pairing of messages. So when you talk about, we give in our hypothetical examples where we showed candidates leaflets that we had designed, we contrast, you have a strength in that area or a perceived strength versus your opponent lacking that. So one of the examples we used is living in the constituency. So that's a very common criticism that's included in leaflets. And I think it is quite a risk, right? As you say, it is a legitimate thing to say. And we know from lots of literature that voters like local candidates. That's why we're seeing more local MPs than ever before. But I think as a candidate, you have to be very careful, right? Because it's one thing to say, I'm local, and to make a great deal of point about your connections to the community. The decision is then whether you counterpoint that with a criticism of your opponent, or whether or not simply making your own case is enough. And our research would suggest that probably criticizing on policy grounds is totally fine, but you might want to focus on personal aspects, on your positive case or the attributes that you have, without mentioning necessarily outright that your opponent lacks them.
Yeah. And why do you think you get that finding when, if you look at a lot of the leaflets that go out, there is more of that negativity in them?
I mean, it's really, I'd like to say that, a lot of the things that happen in leaflets happen because we haven't really studied whether they work or not.
Mm.
So, this is true in lots of different aspects of political behavior. We often feel that we know how the world works, right? Because it's always worked that way. So I think one of the things that's quite interesting about the type of research that I do and many others is really kind of challenging that conventional wisdom. And that's one of the things that we try to do in this paper is to say, okay, well, actually, this is something that everyone does. Does it actually work, or should they not do it at all? Another example of this is local connections, right? So the literature is almost universal in concluding that voters love local candidates. One of the really interesting things that we find in one of our other projects is actually many candidates, even though they have local connections, they don't mention them. So if it matters a great deal to voters, why wouldn't they say, well, I'm a local candidate? Because we know that voters prefer that. So it's lots of things like that where we think we know what voters want to hear, but actually it's an empirical question, as we would say.
Yeah, and I guess one of the questions in terms of the difference between research and reality, or the potential difference between research and reality, is obviously the possibility that research is unearthing things that people are getting wrong. I guess the other possibility is the extent to which, because the research is still slightly artificial, the difference is actually reflecting the limitations of the research. And I guess on particularly that question about negative campaigning and whether you mention the attack on the opponent as the flip side of the positive about yourself, is in the reality of an election with often quite variable levels of knowledge about the candidates. I think there's perhaps a plausible case that by making the contrast, you are providing people with some information that makes the positive message more powerful that they wouldn't otherwise know. And so in the artificial, as it were, situation of, well, which message do you prefer? You might say, well, I prefer message A over message B. But in reality, actually, it's not a choice between message A or message B. It's a choice between message A or an inferior version of message A, because you don't know that other information unless you've been told it. How much of a risk do you think that is? Or am I too much trying to hold on to the idea that political campaigners may still know something?
Oh, I think that's certainly true. I mean, I think the bigger issue is campaigns are really complex. So I was asked by a journalist yesterday, do leaflets win elections? And I said, that's a really tough question to answer. What is the impact of a leaflet, or any indeed leaflets across the board? It's really difficult to tease out, and this goes to your point, really difficult to isolate what is the unique impact of a message, when in fact a campaign is many things. It's your preconceptions about parties, it's what happened to you that day, it's all just, did you go to the supermarket and an item cost more than it did before, right? So there's lots of things that voters bring, including their engagement in politics, they bring to a general election campaign, right? So you're right. In conducting academic research, what we're doing is we're creating a very artificial environment, right? Because we can't replicate the full complexity of a campaign. What we're trying to do is kind of focus on that very small part that comes from that one thing that we're interested in. So just if we could hold everything else constant for just a minute, what would be the effect of that particular thing that we're interested in? And I think that makes the point here. I mean, I think I would never wish to say that if you do this, you will lose, but I think it's one of those things where I think it's worth saying, what types of negativity do voters find okay, right? Because actually, that's quite an important message as well, right? Actually, certain aspects of negativity are completely fine. And voters actually just see that as something that's helpful and provides them with information. But there are other places where we know that negative campaigning can be a risk. There's lots of research that suggests that there can be a backlash. So I think what we want to try to do is we want to not necessarily, I think, tell campaigners what's what, because I think, much of what happens at campaign is done on the ground in the constituency with the knowledge that local people have. I think what we want to do is say, okay, well, this is something you should consider when you're sitting down to write your leaflets and you have that contrast. Maybe this instead of this, right? This might be a risk. You might want to think about whether you want to go that route or not. So I think your point is completely valid. It's you know, that kind of external validity of experiments is always something that we engage with. But I think nonetheless, I think it's that dialogue between practitioners and academics that's really powerful
Yeah.
in these types of
Yeah.
experiments.
And I think there is an interesting question about, which I don't think there is a straightforward answer to, or at least if there is, we don't know what the answer is, about the apparent difference, which I'm convinced is real, but obviously you might not be, between the size of campaign effects that sort of academic research identifies and the size of campaign effects that campaign managers and agents and candidates believe in. In that, I think it's fair to say the broad sort of academic consensus is that campaign effects are relatively small. And you see that both in terms of analysis of campaigns overall, but also things like the sorts of experiments you and others have done and field tests at A/B experiments and so on around particular tactics. The overall picture is not, there's not very much going on there. There's something, but it's not that huge. On the other hand, people like me absolutely believe that you can rock up, run a full-on campaign and make a massive difference. And I guess the archetypal example of that is a parliamentary by-election where the full-on Lib Dem parliamentary by-election team rocks up and you get a 30% swing. And you sort of think that just, there's a campaign effect there. Please, professors of political science, we are not wasting our lives. You cannot. And obviously there are ways of, in part, trying to explain it away, as it were, in terms of it's being a second order election and all of that. And of course, even a parliamentary by-election that gets a relatively high level of media coverage, still the campaign within that seat is a much bigger proportion of the voters' experience than it is, say, a general election with a much higher levels of media coverage. But I do think there is a, almost, if one doesn't want to be too sort of grand about it, a bit like physicists are still struggling to try to reconcile, quantum mechanics and relativity. There is a sort of sense of just, things like the work that you do, the A/B test, that's really good, rigorous research. And yet also you get 30% swings in parliamentary by-elections. There is a mystery there, isn't there?
So sure. I mean, I think both can be true in some sense.
You mean, so basically Lib Dem campaigns have an effect, but everyone else's doesn't?
As a non-partisan academic, I must say that probably they all matter in their own way. No, I would say probably there's a difference between saying that the effects are small and that campaigns don't matter, right? So I would categorically agree that campaigns matter a great deal, in some places more though than others, right? So in a marginal seat, a campaign absolutely makes a difference. So I live in what was formerly a marginal seat, I think perhaps slightly unlikely to be in the next general election, which is a battleground between the Labour and Conservative parties. And they spend a lot of time in their campaigning. Lots of targeting towards Lib Dem voters and Greens because it was really, really close. So, I mean, in that case, having 50 Lib Dems actually turn out, even though their candidate won't win, is really, really important. So things like mobilizing voters and then persuading, that you're a reasonable alternative is really important. So even if you think, for example, that you persuade or you campaign impacts perhaps 1% of a constituency, in lots of constituencies, that will make a huge difference in the outcome, right? So I think...
Although that's why I used parliamentary by-elections as an example, and in deference to your non-partisan nature, I should mention the Labour Party's had some huge swings in recent by-elections as well. And I think if you look at those by-elections, whether they're Labour wins or Lib Dem wins, that's not about, it was a close contest and therefore the campaign had an effect because it tipped the margin. That's about something happening that's very big. And I think you see that in a relatively small number of constituencies at a general election, but you see it almost as a matter of course in parliamentary by-elections. You see it a lot at council elections and council by-elections. And I think that's why I say I think there is a bit of a mystery, because if you're sort of saying that, well, leaflets don't have that much of an effect in that sort of parliamentary arena, but then they sort of seem to in all of these other arenas, maybe there's a question about whether that first conclusion is right.
I think it goes to the question of, does a leaflet need to change someone's mind in order to be important? I think the probability that any one leaflet will change someone's from voting from Labour to the Lib Dems is probably really, really low. We could probably all agree that. But campaigns are more than one leaflet, and they're telling a story, right, for voters that really, to persuade them either to come out to vote or to vote for you, usually both. And I think that I think it's quite difficult, as I said before, to really pull out what is the part of that story that comes from this one particular thing. I think in kind of second order elections like by-elections, I mean, there's also the aspect of the extent to which people want to send a message. I mean, we often talked about that with the European elections when we had them, about it was really about sending a message to the governing party about how happy you are with their performance. And so, I mean, we would argue, I think, in particular, that in recent times, there was a very strong need to send the government a message about, voters' happiness with their record and what they're doing. And so I think that in itself is a mobilizing factor. And if a leaflet can be framed in a way that says to voters, do you want to have your say? Do you want to tell them that you're upset with what's happening? Come out to vote. And that in those types of elections, getting people to the polls is the harder bit, right? Not necessarily persuading them, but people just don't tend to vote in second order elections. So a lot of what you have to do is really convince them that, yes, you need to come out to vote. And I think that's quite important.
Yeah, so a lot more we could discuss about that, but we should maybe turn our eyes to what research you are doing in the current election, and indeed how listeners can help with that, with uploading leaflets. So what are you looking at during this contest?
So I think one of the really interesting things, so, picking up from our other aspects, is we're going to be quite interested in how parties talk about their opponents. We expect quite reasonably that, the challenging parties are going to go quite heavily on the government's record on all manner of things. But I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting about this campaign is how the Conservative Party reacts. Normally, your party is considered to be your greatest electoral asset, right? So, we know that voters vote. Party identification is very important for determining how people vote. So one of the difficult things for the Conservative Party is, how do they frame their leaflets when their party is not an electoral asset? So that's going to be it goes to kind of the heart of what we really love about leaflets, is the local. So one of the things that we expect to see is that many Conservative candidates, and indeed others as well, making a great deal about their connections to the local community and what they've done in office to support the community. And we do really expect to see a kind of disassociation, if you will, with the party leader as well as with the party's national record. To be fair, this isn't unusual. I mean, the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn was not considered to be an electoral asset to many candidates, so he very rarely featured in any of their leaflets. We would expect probably Rishi Sunak to feature less commonly than Boris Johnson, who was at the time perceived to be an electoral asset. So we're going to be quite interested in the local. How do candidates from all parties, how do they talk about their ties to the community? How do they make clear about their local record and their local plans for the community?
And how can people help with your research?
Well, leaflets. The leaflet lady would like your leaflets. So we would really appreciate if volunteers could upload any leaflets that they receive. We have two ways of doing that, so that we work very closely with electionleaflets.org, who has been collecting leaflets since 2005, and they have their own platform for that. Alternatively, we have our own site that's associated with our academic project, which is openelections.co.uk. That allows you to upload a leaflet. In addition, if you'd like, you can also code a leaflet. So we crowdsource coding, ask people to look at leaflets and check whether certain types of messages appear. So we would welcome anything, but the more leaflets that we have, the better. Obviously, we never can, there's so many leaflets delivered in the country and during a general election campaign, it's impossible for us ever to say we've got all of them. But with voters and with help from citizens around the country, we can begin to really get that nuanced picture of how campaigns vary in different parts of the country.
And does direct mail, if people get letters, does that count as a leaflet in this context?
Yes, basically anything that you receive in the post that you didn't order is what we would call a traditional unsolicited communication. So it can be flyers, it can be what you think of a traditional election leaflet, it can even be those newspapers that many people like.
Anything that comes through the letterbox without you having asked for it.
Anything that comes to the letterbox, we will be very happy to take.
Yeah. Excellent. And what's most surprised you about what you've learned so far from looking at more election leaflets than most people?
Yes, I have to say, I think the finding that I found most surprising was about local campaigning. Having there's just some really amazing studies that show that the local really matters to voters. It's one of the kind of truisms, I would say, of British academic findings. I'm always really surprised how little it features in candidates' own
This is as
communications.
in candidates not pointing out how geographically local they are to the
Yes,
constituency, even though the research tells us the voters love that about candidates.
even though the research tells us voters love it, candidates often it's less than half the leaflets focus on that. And one of the really interesting things that we've found associated with some of our previous work is that actually women or female candidates are particularly unlikely to talk about it when they're local. So that's not to say that female candidates are less likely to local. It's that when they are local, they are less likely to tell voters about it. And I think that kind of insight is really powerful because we know we have a representation gap in this country. And so really for us to make the case that actually, people need to, if they have those ties, absolutely, they need to put them at the forefront of their story that they tell for voters.
And do you think that's because of women being more reticent about revealing personal information about themselves, perhaps because of personal safety issues, which obviously can affect men as well? But I think it's fair to say that typically that's that's not completely equal in terms of fears and risks between men and women. Or indeed, and I think we touched on this last time we spoke, it might be their election agent or campaign manager essentially second guessing for them on their behalf and making that decision. It may not be the candidate directly making that decision, which then obviously raises the question about is the person who's making that decision on their behalf themselves a man or a woman? Do you have any sense of what lies under the surface there?
There's two possible explanations I can see, and I think that they're both to some extent true. The first is we know from legions of other disciplines, other types of research, that women are less likely to talk about themselves. I could have phrased it differently, said men are more likely to talk about themselves, but we know that women typically feel less comfortable putting themselves at the forefront of a conversation, right? So talking about their own attributes, and that comes from socialization and how we are raised to be, potentially more modest about our achievements. So some of that is gendered, approaches to behavior. And there's lots of evidence of that. I think the other part is a really valid one. And that's something that was raised to me through a discussion with campaigners around, one of the things that we find is that men are quite happy to talk about the children, and that the children are in local schools and all sorts of things. And a campaigner once said to me, well, actually, my candidate, she feels really uncomfortable talking about her children in the leaflet for exactly the reason that we know. There's a great deal of research, very excellent, coming out recently about showing that female MPs, female candidates are much more likely to take abuse. So I think you can quite easily why you wouldn't want your family to be at the start of that, and in fact yourself. So I think it's a mixture of both. Now, what I would argue is we cannot overcome both of those things. I mean, there are ways to talk about your local connections that I think we can help people feel comfortable. So you don't necessarily need to mention which school your children go to, as some people are quite eager to do. But also talking just about you're working in the local community, and you can talk about those things generically, or even just saying, I live here, I've lived here for 15 years, is something that doesn't provide necessarily that information. So I think one of the things we need to do is empower women and empower female candidates to really, if they have those ties, actually making sure that they know that voters really value those things, and we encourage them to do it in a way that they feel comfortable.
Okay. And I guess that's somewhat different from the picture if we were looking at some other areas of how people behave, because I think there are other areas where and again, obviously there are all sorts of exceptions to this, but the sort of the typical norm is in other areas is not that uncommon to find women more willing to share personal information about themselves than men are. And, there are all sorts of caricatures there, but there is some truth there. What is it, do you think, that makes politics in that sense different? Is it because in that sense, it's about what do you, through a leaflet, it's what are you sharing with some complete strangers? Is that the bit that causes almost that flip of the sort of the classic gender differences?
I think part of it is getting women to feel comfortable with it. The other is I think that women are more likely to feel they have something to prove, right? So,
Yeah.
this is true in many professions,
Mm.
including academia.
Mm.
Political science tends to be a male-dominated field, though that's certainly changing. I think that female candidates, like many female kind of professionals, often feel like they need to establish their credibility in that space. And the way that they do that is so that they don't want to seem as though they're focusing on the wrong things. So that, I think, makes them more naturally gravitate towards focusing on policy positions, focusing on platforms and records and things that they view are directly relevant to the competition.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite important.
Yeah.
But I think it's that need to establish that, that credibility.
Yeah, which I guess is what I find, surprising in a interesting and useful way about the research, because I could just imagine a very similar argument leading to the conclusion, and that's why women are all the more likely to mention their local roots, because that's something that is a much more straightforward way of establishing your credibility in the eyes of voters, as opposed to, say, the difficulty that if you've taken a career break for several years, which is more likely to be a woman than a man having done that, although men do that. In fact, I'm technically on a career break at the moment myself. Is that, if you've taken a career break, then actually all of the things you might be doing during that period might make you really well suited to be an MP, but are probably harder to convey than if you've got the convenience of an employer or a job title to refer to. But your localness, in a way, could be the easy entry thing that everyone really makes something out of. And yet, as your research shows, the reality is the exact opposite of that, which I guess shows the value of political science.
We live to please. Yes, and I think that's quite important. I mean, there's been many discussions about, previous prime ministers, Theresa May, Margaret Thatcher, and about whether or not them not having children was an asset or not. I think that plays out extensively in American politics. I think there would be a reticence, I think to candidates to saying things like making the fact that they have children to be an asset, right? So, because actually, oftentimes being a parent does give you an insight to things like access to primary school education and nursery school education. So there are many aspects of policy that women might be better placed because of their life experiences to weigh in on. But I think there is, as you say, that reticence to bring that to present that as an asset, right? As a way of saying, as a kind of as an attribute that one should make a great deal of. And I think because I think oftentimes the counterpoint to that could be is voters, they can have preconceptions about the ability of women to juggle career versus personal. And so I think women do, often worry that in making their family commitments a part of their campaign, that they risk voters thinking that they don't have the capacity to be an MP. And that's absolutely not true. Women can juggle many things as can men. So
I wonder if there's also something else going on there in addition, which is also reflected with religion, because it strikes me that, if somebody is a parent or religious or both, those two things are a big part of who they are. And if you're wanting to understand what they are like as a person, what they therefore may be like as a politician making decisions in the future, what their values are, what their priorities are, it would be really weird to write a biography of, let's say, a politician who has children and is very religious and not mention any of them. You'd think, I'm not just getting the story of the person. But despite the fact that, almost by definition, being religious is about believing in a particular way that you should lead your life. And therefore you would, you might think, well, that's very relevant to being a politician. Our general sort of, and this applies both for people who are religious and not religious, our general outlook, at least in Britain in this century, is that religion isn't really something to be at the forefront of politics. the famous quote about Tony Blair, saying he doesn't do God, not talk about religion. Obviously, sometimes politicians' religious views, when they particularly relate to possible policy stances, are rather more in the news, as has been the case, particularly with the SNP recently. But there is a sense of, even though there is such a strong, as it were, logical case to say either about religion or parenthood, that is relevant to understanding the rounded person and therefore the politician, that there's also a real reticence about both. And I think the religion one is an interesting one, because I think that does apply equally to men and women. I don't think we get gender differences about whether or not you should talk about your religious views.
Yeah, I think the risk of religion versus perhaps thinking about something like gender, I mean, you know, that is more common, right? Whereas religion, yes, many people are religious, but I think there's a greater risk that it polarizes, that it polarizes then brings people in, right? So politicians generally want to share attributes that are likely to connect them with others, right? So to some extent, your religious background is only really an asset to the extent that other people share that with you. So, I mean, and I think given the demographics, currently in the country, it's quite difficult for any politician to really claim, particularly within a constituency, that this is likely to be an asset. Now, obviously, that varies significantly in different parts of the country and different types of demographics. But I think religion is quite a difficult one. I mean, it goes to, we can talk about the culture wars, right? So, I mean, any aspect of kind of polarizing aspect where beliefs are, kind of playing out and on the very dramatic scale, those types of opinions become quite risky for politicians to express, right? Where I think something like your local ties or you having children is something that most of us would find kind of relatively uncontroversial in that sense. So I think most people could relate, or you can be reasonably sure that probably quite a few of your constituents have children or things of that nature.
Yeah. And indeed, that point about what people sort of share as their attributes, I think, is one of the reasons why often when you look at polling on particular policy areas, there is less of a generational divide than you might otherwise expect. And my favourite example, in the last couple of years has been polling around the pension triple lock, because that's often portrayed as a policy aimed at securing the votes of older people, and people who don't like the policy often portray their attacks on it as being, this is about standing up for younger people who will be horribly done down by the triple lock policy. But when you look at the polling on it, although the triple lock policy on pensions is more popular the older people are, even amongst the youngest age group, there is much more support for the policy than opposition to that. And that may partly be about people thinking forward, to everyone hopefully will get to be a pensioner at some point. But also the simple fact that people have parents and grandparents, and you can be in favour of a policy that is, maybe not great for you, but great for your parent or your grandparent, and therefore be really keen on it. And so I think there is a degree to which these connections sort of bring people together. But again, comes back to that interesting question, therefore, of, well, maybe knowing a bit more about whether a politician has a child, or a grandparent is perhaps of interest. During this general election, I suspect one of the most common bits of information that features in interviews with Ed Davey, says leader of Liberal Democrats, will be his own background as a carer. And that clearly has really heavily influenced his political sort of outlook and his priorities. And that's both reasonable to mention, but you can imagine an attack leaflet on Ed that had to go over a policy might be, maybe attacking the Lib Dem policy for better treatment for carers. Maybe somebody might think, it's bad for whatever reason. That probably would go down very differently, though, from a leaflet that in a way has a personal go at him. But I do always think there is a little bit of, if you're going to play the personal for the positives, like if you're going to mention, I've got local roots in this community because my kids go to school here, it is fair dues in a way that if, say, one of your kids is a repeat criminal offender who has burnt down the local school, it's hard to then say, if you've boasted about being the parent with local connections, to say, actually, no, the behaviour of my teenager is nothing to do with me. That shouldn't nobody should mention it. That's terribly unfair.
And I think think in leaflets, I mean, I suspect that a candidate in that particular situation would find they probably had better things to do than stand for election at that particular point in time.
Hopefully, well, hopefully, or maybe standing for election would be a blessed relief from all of
Yes.
those other problems in their life.
But I do think it is quite relevant. I mean, and that could be part of the story around local ties, is that once you bring them in, you can't put it back in the box. So if you open the door, other people can walk through it. So I think, but I do think it's quite important. I think one of the things that we need to do better in this country is to make voters understand that politicians are like us, and that's what local connections is really about. Is you making the claim that, I'm one of you, I understand your concerns because my kids go to the same schools that your kids go to. So we experience the same things that you do. And I think that's quite powerful. That's quite a powerful message for thinking about who you want to represent you at the national scale. Is you want someone who understands what you go through in your area. So I think to the extent that candidates can make that positive case, I think it's really important. So yeah, there's a lot to think about. As campaigns are rich and nuanced, but thankfully leaflets give us a great insight into what people think is important, and also kind of how that message varies across the country.
And the more leaflets that listeners upload to your website, the more you'll be able to dig into. So I look forward to having a future discussion, if I may, with you about what you have discovered from the leaflets in this election. But in the meantime, very many thanks for your time. I will include a link to the website for uploading leaflets in the show notes, and look forward to chatting to you when you've had a chance to digest all of those bar charts.
Thanks, Mark.
Brilliant.